Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we will tackle some of the bitterest and, from the Allied side, most controversial actions of the Italian campaign and indeed of the entire war. The four battles of Monte Cassino, also known as the Battle for Rome. Why did the Allies struggle so much? Did they commit a massive war crime? And was the campaign worth it in the first place? Let's find out. Hi Jesse, good to be back. We're here for yet another episode. This time round we're going to sunny Italy. We have looked at very snowy plains in Russia in previous episodes, so it's time for a little bit of sunshine today. But of course it's not all glorious and nice in Italy in 1943-1944. So let's analyze this particular campaign, these particular battles, as we already said, extremely controversial. So before we really start talking about the four battles, well, let's set the scene and let's look at the strategic situation and the geography, which plays a vital role in this fight, in this battle. So, Jesse, tell us a little bit about the Italian campaign and also the geography.
All right, Matthias, I'm going to set the stage for us again, as per usual, because you are the man who's been on the ground just recently around Monte Cassino. And so we're going to get into the details and what you've done, where you've been, what you've seen, what impressions you have of how that battle plays out when you're actually walking the ground on the battlefield in a moment. But of course, and maybe we say this every episode, but I never get tired of saying it, the context is king for historians, right? So let's take that step back. Now, in 1943, the Allies decide to invade Sicily as their next big move in the Mediterranean. That goes relatively well. They're able to capture Sicily. Then they decide, hey, we're going to invade mainland Italy, which they do in 1943 as well. By 1944, things probably are not playing, I think it's fair to say that things are probably not playing out quite the way the Allies had hoped in their optimistic predictions about what might happen when they land on the Italian mainland. It's not quite the soft underbelly of Europe that one often hears about. And one of the reasons for that is geography, right? The Italian peninsula is relatively narrow. I think the average width is something like 150 kilometers or so. And a huge chunk of that, especially down the middle of it, is mountains. There's a couple of different mountain ranges, but it's mountainous. And of course, mountains mean the defense has a very serious advantage. So even though the Italian army is out of the picture, once Italy leaves the war in 1943, the Germans are able to increase their force de frappe, if I'm going to borrow an expression from French, their kind of combat power, by defending in this difficult terrain. By early 1944, the Allies are facing prepared German positions. So basically what the Germans have done is they've kind of gone on a fighting retreat up the bottom of the Italian peninsula, waiting and preparing better defenses on picked areas. And now, in early 1944, they've reached those lines that they've prepared. There are many different lines with many different names. The Winter Line is kind of a general idea of a series of lines. And in the area of the famous Monte Cassino, which is going to be the focus for much of the fighting we're going to talk about today, there is the Gustav Line. And it's anchored on a bunch of different positions. But Matthias, why don't you take us through some of the key positions here? So we're like a third of the way up the Italian peninsula. Rome is still in German hands. But you have this Gustav Line that the Germans have prepared. And now their fighting retreat comes to an end. And they're going to make a stand. So what does that line look like?
Well, this line is it's not a continuous line of concrete or positions, but it is a line that consists of dugouts or fortified entrenched positions where possible. And the whole idea really is to deny the road network, which is very limited in this area. It's basically one main road, the State Road number 6, which leads all the way up from the south to Rome, to deny this to the Allies. Because the understanding is that if they manage to break through here and control this particular road, it will be quite difficult to stop them from getting to Rome. And when you look at the terrain, you already mentioned it, it's not only hilly, it's mountainous. People that haven't been there get completely the wrong idea, because we always think Italy, that sunny beaches and warm overpriced drinks, it's all just very nice. But actually, it's very, very mountainous. And you have this mountain ridge that basically runs like a spine through the entire boot of Italy. So it makes it the perfect country for the defender. You have in front of you, if you're now in the German position and you're looking to the southeast towards where the Allies are coming from, in front of you, you have the so-called Liri Valley. This is open, this is flat territory. This is in many ways the perfect terrain for the Allies to operate, to maneuver in, to use the superior air force, to use superior artillery, and also the tank forces. But then you hit the mountains of the Gustav Line and the situation completely changes here. And suddenly the defender is in a much, much stronger position. And as you've already said, the Germans are able to really defend this because they buy time by having all these other defensive lines. And when the Allies finally hit this line in January 1944, they're not in for a treat, they're not in for the ride, and the Germans are making this really, really complex. So maybe have a look at some of the troops that we're looking at here. So, Jesse, perhaps you can start by having a quick chat about the Allied forces that we're encountering.
Yes, no doubt. I will have to say, though, one other thought or one other observation about the geography before we get into the people aspect is that not only do you have this high ground dominating the Gustav Line, but you also have the rivers, right? You mentioned the Liri Valley. Well, the Liri River runs through it. But there's also an east-west river just in front of the Gustav Line, the Garigliano River, which then changes into the Rapido River or the Gari River, depending. There's some historical confusion about the names. So you basically have a river. If you're looking from the Allied point of view, you have a river. On the other side, yes, there's this very appealing Liri Valley, but it's overlooked by these towering mountain positions, including Monte Cassino. So that's just to get us really in the mood geographically. As far as the troops go, the Allied armies in Italy are an absolute United Nations. I mean, there are few fronts where you have such a diversity of different troops. They're divided into two main armies, the 5th U.S. Army under Clark, and they're on the western side of the peninsula, and then the 8th British Army under Montgomery. Later, it comes under the command of Oliver Leese during the Cassino battles, but at first it's under Montgomery. And they're advancing up the eastern coast, the other side of the Italian peninsula. And they're all under the command of Harold Alexander, British general, who later, by the way, becomes the Governor General of Canada. Little Canadian content fact in there for all our Canadian listeners. Governor General is a representative of the monarchy in Canada. The Germans on the other side, they're under General Albert von Kesselring. And one of the things that I find interesting, as I say, is this diversity of troops. You have Polish troops with the Allies. Of course, in addition to the Americans and Brits, you have a Polish corps, you have New Zealand troops, including Maori troops, you have Indian divisions, Gurkhas, and all sorts of other types of Indian troops as well. You have the Canadians. The 1st Canadian Division is there and has been fighting in Italy and Sicily beforehand, quite experienced, had some difficult fighting in Ortona the previous December. So, and I'm surely forgetting some. Of course, you also have quite a famous smaller American unit made up of Japanese Americans, even though their compatriots back home were under suspicion, being interned in the US. The combat unit of Japanese Americans is in Italy, which is quite an interesting little footnote there. Did I forget anyone, Matthias, in that smorgasbord of nations fighting on the Allied side?
I think we've got the melting pot presented to us quite nicely.
The Free French.
The Free French are there, exactly. Absolutely.
The Free French. The Moroccans especially, yes, forgot them, under Alphonse Juin. But how about the Germans? I mean, they have a towering reputation for their performance, especially the paratroopers. Is it really merited, this reputation they have, the Fallschirmjäger?
Well, when you look at how they performed during the battle, probably yes. And even today, to the German paratroopers, there are, even though officially they're not allowed to commemorate them because they are from the wrong type of war, so to speak, but there are two events that still stand out and are commemorated and are remembered. And the first one is, of course, is Crete. So here's another podcast for us. And the second one is Monte Cassino and the performance of the German paratroopers at Monte Cassino. The British commander, he said that, well, it would be difficult to imagine another unit, another formation to go through what the German paratroopers had gone through and keep fighting with the same spirit, which, of course, was absolutely brilliant for German propaganda at that time. But the paras are only part of the troops who are there. You already mentioned some of the senior commanders, so let's start with them. You already mentioned Kesselring. He is an interesting character because he's an Air Force field marshal, but he actually started his military life as an artilleryman. So he understands both sides, both the air war and the land war. And that, of course, is very useful. The commander of 10th Army, which is the German army fighting in this area, is a chap called Heinrich von Vietinghoff-Scheel. Again, very experienced, a very good defensive commander. And then if we take it one further down, we're now looking at the corps that is fighting there. That is the German 14th Panzer Corps under Fridolin von Senger und Etterlin. So you can see a lot of fonts, so very, very good German military stock, you might say. The Senger and Etterlin und Etterlin, he is a very, very interesting character because not only is he a very good military commander, like most of these names I've just mentioned, gained experience in Poland and France on the Eastern Front. So they know how to do this fighting business. But also, he's a very clever man, speaks several languages. He's fluent in Italian. He actually serves as the liaison officer to the Italian army for a number of years. He is a former Rhodes Scholar. So before the First World War, he was actually sent to Oxford to study. So you can see he's not stupid. He's also a layman of the Benedictine order. And of course, the whole monastery and the whole story around the monastery that we're looking at a little bit later is, of course, very, very close to his heart when you look at it from this point of view. And when we look at the units then, yes, we've got the paratroopers there. We also have, of course, in inverted commas, normal infantry and panzer grenadier divisions. Most of these experienced, some of these reconstituted. Some of them have the numbers of divisions that had been defeated and destroyed in Stalingrad. But on the whole, very, very experienced. Of course, the one nation that we haven't really mentioned so far is the Italians. So we're fighting here in Italy, but we're not really talking about Italian soldiers. So Jesse, what about the Italians? Where are they? What are they doing?
Well, most of them are in POW camps somewhere under German control at this stage, because essentially when Italy collapses and withdraws from the war officially in 1943, after Sicily is invaded, the Italian army is essentially taken prisoner en masse without resistance by their former German allies. And then they're like any other POW, and they're sent to camps and they're sent to work. Many of them are sent back to Germany to work in industries there. There's a terrible massacre during the Battle of Berlin of unarmed, defenseless Italian POWs and so on. But they're a non-factor, essentially, at this stage, as an ally of Germany. There is a puppet regime under German protection, let's say, in the north of the country, but its forces don't play a significant role in the Italian campaign.
So yes, prisoners of war or they'd just been sent home by the Germans, and quite a few of them simply and merely return and go home. There was a bit of a worry in the German camp when Italy decided to drop out of the war, that would cause all sorts of issues and problems. But it's very surprising and perhaps even confusing how successfully the Germans managed to disarm the Italians and take over this entire country with basically the reinforcements of only 2 divisions. So that in itself is a very interesting story, but we're not really looking at this today. That's a different story. It's just interesting to mention that the Italians are practically out. We'll be looking at civilian casualties later, but as a fighting force, the Italians in this area do not really play a role. When you go slightly further to the southeast, and you look at the shaping battles that happened in late 1943, in December 1943. So this is the fighting to break into the Liri Valley, to basically make your way towards the Gustav Line and the German positions. This is where, for the very first time, the Italians actually do fight on the Allied side. But this is previous to this particular battle. This, perhaps you might even call it, mini campaign of Monte Cassino that we are looking at today. So the Italians are, you might say, a little bit out. When you look at the battle itself, the campaign itself, there is a little bit of confusion, as always, because we're talking about things that happen in war. Everything is always confusing and confused. There is confusion as to what really happens, of course. We'll unpack that, how it happens, why it happens. And that starts with the numbering of the battles. So in the Allied camp, on the Allied side, we talk of the 4 battles of Monte Cassino, lasting from January all the way to May 1944. In the official German numbering, we only have 3, because the Germans combined the first and the second battle. So that in itself already shows you a little bit about this perception that we find, the different ways people see these battles being fought out. So maybe it's now time to dig in, to do more than just scratch the surface and have a look at what actually happens on the ground and why this whole episode is so controversial, particularly on the Allied side. So let's start with the very first battle. Jesse, can you give us some insights into what happens there and why and how it all plays out?
Well, the first battle starts in the middle of January. And if any of you have been in a mountainous area in the middle of January in the Northern Hemisphere, it's probably not the ideal time you would pick to start launching an attack. It's cold, it's wet, there can be snow, of course, difficult weather conditions, and then the mountains on top of that make for a significant challenge. Plus, you're going up against this prepared line of defense. The idea of the first battle is we being the Allies in this case, I'm putting myself in the Allied shoes for the moment. We've got to cross this river barrier before we can even think about getting up on the high ground, be it the Cassino Massif itself, just on the eastern edge of the Liri Valley, or what are called the Arunzi Mountains, just on the western edge of the Liri Valley. So you have the valley, but it's overlooked by these 2 huge peaks. And the idea is, first and foremost, you've got to get across this river, this Garigliano River that's separating you from your objectives if you're the Allies. So US, British, and Free French troops are going to be sort of the main players on the Allied side. They are going to engage in a series of attacks. So every few days, there's a new attack from a different part of this very narrow front, trying to get across the river, trying to get up onto the slopes of Monte Cassino. There are a few different access points, and trying to take some of the villages on the other side of the river as well. Overall, this does not go particularly well, right? So there are a couple of toeholds that are established on the other side of the river. There's a little bit of progress made uphill, especially by the French, but it doesn't go particularly well. And one example, the river, of course, is extra swollen. It's much faster and higher than it normally is. One of the divisions, one of the formations that has the unenviable task of trying to participate in these initial assaults is the American 36th Division. It's not really able to make much progress getting across the river. And one of the reasons why are scenes like this one, that I'm about to quote from, by an American sergeant, Sergeant Kirby. He's in this 36th American Division, trying to cross near one of the villages. And this is kind of how he sums up his experience. We were under constant fire. I saw boats being hit all around me, guys falling out and swimming. I never knew whether they made it or not. When we got to the other side, it was the only scene I ever saw in the war that lived up to what you see in the movies. I'd never seen so many bodies. I remember seeing this kid getting hit by a machine gun. The bullets hitting his body pushed him along like a tin can. So, I mean, that's a pretty vivid description of an assault that is not going well, right? So, you have dug in Germans, you have exposed allies. The allies don't make enough use of their suppressive fire, their superiority in fire. They can't make use of their armor very well when they are able to try to use it. They have to lay special steel mats on these small little tracks. I mean, this is rural, mountainous Italy. You don't have nice, wide, paved roads all over the place. You've got tracks, or you've got mountain tracks. And so in winter, this is going to be a problem for tanks. So you can see that things are already going to be quite difficult. So that's the French, I should say, before I pass the baton to you, Matthias, to start taking us into the analysis, the French actually do not that bad. They scale very, very steep hills near a height called the Col Belvedere or Col Belvedere. My Italian's not as good as my French here.
Ciao bello.
That's pretty much the extent of it, I have to say. And they do capture that height, which in theory could mean, maybe we can start outflanking Monte Cassino a little bit. And the French General Alphonse Juin, he asks for reinforcements to exploit this success, but he doesn't get them. They're sent elsewhere where they don't achieve very much. So there was a moment of partial hope, thanks to the French North African troops, but they can't sustain that, and they get pushed off of that height, and then the whole thing kind of stops, essentially. So fill in the gaps here, Matthias. Take us down now. I've given us a bit of the bird's eye view. Take us down into some of the trenches, so to speak.
Well, the interesting thing is really that the French are having a really good time up at the very northern end of this particular battle in the sector. And they really worry the Germans. So this really is the successful part of the first battle. And you're absolutely right. You've said it. Well, you go there and you stand there. For example, you get a very good view of that particular part of the battlefield from the big German military cemetery, which is there, which holds about 20,000 bodies. And you can see these are very, very high peaks. And you already mentioned the names of probably the most prominent one in that particular area. And the French are very successful. But it is winter time. So there are pictures where you see these people walking around in snow, half a meter of snow. So this is proper, you might perhaps even say, alpine warfare. And when the French are about to break through, the Germans are really worried, and Zengan Etterlin, the corps commander, says, well, we should send reinforcements there. But actually the problem is they haven't got any anymore. And so it's the troops of the German 5th Mountain Division that have to fight all by themselves in that area. It's also interesting, one of the very, very few times where you have mountain troops fighting against mountain troops. So German mountain troops against the French ones. And in the end, they managed to hold them. But you're right, if the French had broken through here, they would have been able to completely unhinge the German position. And this formidable Gustav line could have been broken and become worthless within a few days. But they don't get the reinforcements. You already mentioned that. The official reason that would be too difficult to sustain more troops in that particular part of the front line. You then have, if you take it further to the south, you then have the 34th US Division. This originally is pretty much a US fight, the first battle, which tries to go into Monte Cassino itself, across that river that you already mentioned, which in the northern part of Cassino is a very, very small creek. You can actually jump over it, very different further to the south, and then break into the city from the north. And they are stopped and halted by the Germans. They also try to move up towards the area of the monastery itself, which towers over the town of Cassino, which looms there like a big evil animal, you might say, staring at the Allies. And they think that the Germans are in there. We'll return to that famous episode a little bit later.
Sounds like a German fairy tale.
It does a little bit. And actually, now they've got lots of deep, dark woods. My favorite phrase. Not so many.
See, I knew we were going there.
Not so many deep, dark woods there in those days. It was all bare and rock, which again made it easier for the defenders. But now a lot of deep, dark woods. There we go. And so they are stopped. And then we go into the sector of the 36th Division. and you already mentioned this, that is a complete victory for the Germans. And further to the south, in the Aurunci Mountains, this is the other bit that really worries the Germans. And this is also the part of the battle that no one really ever looks at, to be perfectly honest, when you start analyzing the battle, because you're now on the other side of the valley. When you stand there and you see these heights, they're nearly as high as the mountains in the Cassino area. So you need to seize these as well. And the British nearly break through there. So this is in particular the 5th Division and the 56th Division of the 10th British Corps. And the Germans sent the last remaining reserves that they have into this particular area. They managed to stop the British there, drive them back across the river, and the front line there stops. And when we look at the center of this Allied attack, you already talked about it in some detail, so I can keep it quite short. So this is the attack by the 36th US Division. A complete disaster for the Americans. Some people have called it the worst military disaster of the US Army in its history, because when you look at the losses that they suffer as a percentage of the troops encountered, they're absolutely horrendous. They try to get across the river. You talked about this. The terrain doesn't help. It's wet. It's marshy. There's lots of barbed wire that the Germans put up there. The river is very fast flowing. It's very, very deep, very steep banks, very difficult to get across. The Americans have got rubber boats, which they want to use. Most of these get destroyed by German machine gun fire, barbed wire, and so they can't get enough troops across. They try to get troops across. Some of them build a small bridgehead, but this is then eliminated by German counterattacks. And fighting that takes about, roughly speaking, 1.5 days. So starting on the 20th of January, 2 regiments of this division, this American division, attacked to the north and south of a place called San Angelo. San Angelo is known as the most heavily fortified position on the German front line. And there's a reason for that. We are now in the valley. This is still relatively open terrain. Yes, you've got a river in front of you, but once the Americans cross that river, it's open terrain. So you really need a stronghold in this area if you're German. And the Americans attacked to the north and to the south of it with 2 regiments, 141st and 143rd Regiment. Lots of fighting, very nasty. When you look at the casualties, they're absolutely horrendous. And it's actually the one of the regimental commanders, he's recorded as standing there when he sends his troops into battle, crying and weeping, because he knows it's going to be disaster. The divisional commander asks Clark, the US commander, not to push with this advance, do not insist on having this, but he says, no, you need to do it. There were some personal tensions between these two as well. But if we just look at the final outcome, the 143rd Regiment loses 969 men. The 141st Regiment loses 1,050. Shortly after the battle, they do a roll call and they come to the conclusion that at that stage, they've had casualties of 54%. That is a lot. Particularly when you compare that to the Germans, who are very worried about the French attack in the north. They're very worried about the British attack in the south. Here, when you look at the war diary of the Corps, the Panzer Corps, 14th Panzer Corps, it mentions these actions that are so famous on the Allied side, particularly, of course, the Americans, in basically 1.5 sentences. And it says, enemy river crossing attempts in area of 15th Panzer Grenadier Division bloodily repulsed. Enemy force that managed to cross the river destroyed or captured. And this is it. To them, it's a sideshow. I would perhaps even say a sideshow to a sideshow to a sideshow when you look at the casualties. We just heard the numbers for the Americans. On the German side, wait for it. Here's the tension. Dum, 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 dum. On the German side, we're looking at 14 killed and 42 wounded. So that is basically nothing. So this is a huge success on the German side. But of course, there's other stuff happening. If you take it up again to the more strategic level and look at what else is happening at that time in that particular area. So what's happening about, 80, 90 kilometers further up the coast? Jesse, what's going on there? And it's not the war for towels on the beach. That comes a bit later.
That was a very German inside joke. For those of you who might not be familiar, Germans are famous/infamous in Europe as tourists for staking out their positions on the beach with towels. So this German propensity for conquering territory continues even on European vacation beaches. Anyway, that aside, all these terrible losses and missed opportunities in the assault on the Gustav line, in theory, you could say, well, they're putting a lot of pressure on the Germans. And if our strategy works, those kind of losses and even local failures could be justified. And so, what is the strategic gamble that we're taking to make these losses worthwhile? And that is the amphibious landing at a place called Anzio, which is, as you mentioned, north of the Gustav Line, so behind German lines, between the Gustav Line and Rome, essentially, more or less. So the idea of the Allies is that while they're putting pressure, while they're trying to capture Monte Cassino and the positions around there, that they're going to land behind the Germans, which they do on January 22nd, around a place called Anzio, and they're going to threaten the German rear. So those roads, Matthias, that you mentioned leading north towards Rome, I think it's Route 6 and Route 7. One of them's partly flooded with swamps, but the Germans also depend on those for their communications, their logistics. They cannot sustain their defensive line at the Gustav Line if they don't have access to those roads leading north. So the Allies figure, well, if we can land there, we'll threaten those lines. Maybe we can even move inland. We catch the Germans by surprise and we cut them off. And wouldn't that be a resounding victory? We can capture the Germans instead of having to fight them in the mountains. But there are a few complications in the plan, let's say. Things are a little bit rushed. The US Fifth Army has a very tough time moving up to the Gustav Line, so they take heavy losses kind of in the last weeks moving up to the Gustav Line, so they're not super well prepared for the Gustav Line attacks, but also for Anzio, because Clark is responsible for both. And this is one of the potential criticisms that maybe too much was on his plate. He's trying to oversee this landing at the same time as he's overseeing the ground assault of the Gustav Line. There are claims that generals needed to contact him to make decisions and things could have gone differently, but he was too busy, let's say. So what happens is the British and Americans land troops at Anzio. It's called Operation Shingle. They need to do this relatively quickly because those landing craft that they're going to use, they only have them for a limited time. They're going to be sent back to England to be used in the Normandy invasion. So they've got to go now while they have access to these relatively scarce landing craft, and they get bogged down. Now, the local general, US General Lucas, has come in for some criticism as well, that he wasn't aggressive enough, that they could have done something more with the landing at Anzio if they'd pushed harder at the beginning. But as it happens, it gets bogged down. The Germans reorganize. They create a separate command, 14th Army, to contain the Anzio bridgehead. And so it doesn't really work out as planned. That's the general gist of things. But of course, Matthias, you're the details guy. Take us further into it. Why doesn't Anzio work?
Well, probably the main reason is, and that's why it's come under a lot of criticism for it, is the American commander who is not particularly keen on advancing very, very quickly. So he wants to consolidate his position first. He'd actually been warned by Clark that the Germans would counterattack and he would have to have a good defensive base before he breaks out and goes into what's called the Alban Hills. So these are the ones beyond the road. Again, that's the road leading all the way from Cassino to Rome. If you reach those, you've cut off the Germans in the Cassino position. But they're very slow. They're very methodical. Perhaps it helps to know that the American commander there is an artillery officer, and I'm allowed to say that as an artillery officer myself. We are very methodical. Well, people sometimes call it boring, but there we are. But that's how he works. And so he's not particularly enthusiastic. He doesn't really drive things forward. And the Germans can't believe their luck. When you look at the German accounts and also the reports that come out, they say, what the heck is going on here? We don't understand that they're not pushing inland. But actually, perfect for us, because as you said, they then managed to get troops into that area. They actually counterattack. They drive the Americans, but also the British back then, but they can't eliminate that bridgehead, not least because you then have naval gunfire support. So it's a bit looking forward a little bit to what happens and in Normandy in 1944 as well. But then, as you say, it sets down for a policy of containment on the German side. And it sits there like an ulcer, but it doesn't really affect the fighting too much at that particular stage. But where it is interesting is that you can suddenly see how these two different geographical areas and these different fightings actually interact with one another. So, for example, in the Monte Cassino area, the Allies are now pushing and pushing again and pushing again because they think, well, you know what, we need to keep the pressure on the Germans here, because otherwise the Germans will be able to release troops from Monte Cassino and send them to Anzio, even though, of course, the original plan had to be exactly the other way around. So you can see how this is impacting both sides. And with that, I mean both sides in the Allied camp more than the German camp. And of course, that is problematic because you can see that being played out already now when you look at the second battle and why the second battle is fought. One of the main reasons is, we are worried that something's happening up in Anzio. We need to act here. We need to act quickly because the Allies know through Ultra that the Germans are planning in February, mid-February, a big counterattack at Anzio. So you can see how they then rush into the next attack. And that, of course, is the famous second battle of Monte Cassino. So what happens there? Give us some clues.
Well, first of all, these numbered battles reminds me a bit of the First World War, with the first Battle of Ypres, the second, the third, and so on. And here we are, the first and second and third and fourth, if you're on the Allied, from the Allied point of view, battles of Monte Cassino. And this, I think, speaks to the bitter local and tactical and positional nature of the fighting. And we saw some of that in the first battle. One stat that stuck out at me in particular was apparently the average time it took to get an American casualty from that disastrous action, those disastrous actions in the first battle, to get them to treatment, medical treatment, is nearly 10 hours. And now that's much more of a First World War type stat than today's famous NATO's golden hour, right, where you're supposed to get treatment in the first hour. So quite bitter. And even though the Germans are having success, they're under pressure. At some point, von Senger and Etterlin actually suggests retreating to a new line north of Anzio, but Kesselring says no. You know, we've got this. And it turns out Kesselring was probably right. And then the second battle comes. And I think, you know, the idea here for the Allies is, okay, so we can't reuse the troops that were already in the line for the first battle. As you mentioned, you know, these casualties are unsustainable. The French Herculean efforts on the heights exhaust them as well. So the burden is going to be borne mostly by different troops. So the British, for example, they bring in an Indian division and New Zealand troops as well. And these are in a corps under the command of a New Zealand commander who has a bit of a checkered reputation from some mistakes at the Battle of Crete in 1941. That's Bernhard Freiberg. And again, the Allies are in a bit of a rush, right? As you mentioned, there's pressure because, well, Anzio and the Germans are going to attack there. So trying to prepare for an attack, I think sometimes we non-military people, and I include myself in that, we underestimate the complications that are not connected to actually fighting. So setting up your division in this case, let's take the 4th Indian Division as our example here. It's very difficult to position all your troops, to get everything ready in winter, in the mountains, when your positions are being overlooked by the enemy who's on the high ground. So all of this is already eating away at the chances of success for this second battle. In fact, Freiberg himself said supposedly that he estimates we have a 50% chance of success. And one of the reasons why he's worried is because of the position of this abbey, this historic abbey that's perched on top of the Monte Cassino that's still overlooking the Allied positions. And so I think I'm going to take us now into probably the most controversial aspect of the battle. The abbey's up there. It's an ancient pilgrimage site. It was founded in the 6th century. The German commander promises that the abbey's not going to be used for military purposes, even though as part of the hill it's on is a key part of the German defenses. They tell the Allies that. They tell the Vatican that. But the Allies think that the Germans might still be using it in spite of their promises. There's some air observation photographs. Some officers go up in airplanes. They look at it. They say, we think maybe There are some German troops there. We saw this. We saw a radio mast potentially. There's some chatter in the newspapers that the Germans might be using this position, even though they promised not to. Obviously, the Allies don't really trust anything that the Germans say at this stage in the war. There's a lot of debates between Allied commanders. Should we do something about this position? Is it being used by the enemy or not? In the end, they decide to bomb it. Clark is not really in favor, so he tells Alexander, look, I'll do it, but only if you issue me the direct order, which Alexander then does. So they plaster it with heavy bombers. More than 200 bombers end up attacking the Abbey position. And there were no German military there at that stage, initially, before it was bombed. This, even the US official history then admits later that there were none. The people who were there were Italian civilians and the monks, of course. Italian civilians, several hundred, had gathered there to take shelter from the fighting in the villages and the town of Cassino around, and many of them were killed. So it's quite a tragic event, and I would say it's quite a tragic mistake. I don't know if one could use stronger language than that, but let's start that way and get the ball rolling. What's your assessment of it?
Well, it is really interesting. I've had this discussion a number of times, even at the Abbey. I remember last time I was there, I suddenly bumped into some relatively senior retired British military personnel, and they were on a battlefield tour. We started talking about the standing in the Abbey grounds. And the first question, of course, was, so what do you think? Was it a war crime, yes or no? Let's use the slightly stronger term. And it played out very much along national lines. So all the Brits saying, no, it wasn't a necessity, whereas I said, yes, in my eyes, it is a war crime. There is absolutely no need to bomb it. We know that, now we know the Germans weren't in there. So that makes it, in my eyes, a war crime, particularly if you then include the fact, if you already mentioned it, that about 100, no one really knows exactly, Italian civilians were killed. Plus, by the way, 40 soldiers from the Indian division who'd got a bit too close to the hill. So it's an ongoing debate. It's never ending. It was debated in those days. As you said, there's controversy. Shall we bomb it? Shall we not? When you look at the correspondence, to me, it looks a little bit as if everybody knew that this was a tricky decision. No one really wanted to make a decision, and they passed it on. Because quite often you get, I don't really think it's a good idea, but if you think we should, then we will. And it all goes back to basically an order that was sent out by Eisenhower in December 1943. Because they said, we're now fighting in Italy, and there's so many cultural artifacts. How are we going to deal with this? And if I just read from that, it says it's actually subject historical monuments. That's what it says, to all commanders. And he says, if we have to choose between destroying a famous building and sacrificing our own men, then our men's lives count infinitely more and the building must go. But the choice is not always so clear-cut as that. In many cases, the monuments can be spared without any detriment to operational needs. Nothing can stand against the argument of military necessity. This is an accepted principle. But the phrase military necessity is sometimes used where it should be more truthful to speak of military convenience or even of personal convenience. I think that sums it up quite nicely. Yes, you can't really blame the people making the decision because they put the intelligence picture together and they thought, you know what, intelligence tells us Germans are in the Abbey. There are accounts from the Italians saying that when the Germans there, they're looting the Abbey. I'll return to that in a minute. There's also one famous incident where British intelligence picks up a message that the Germans sent out, and it says the Abt ABT is back in the monastery, which British intelligence interprets as ABT, meaning the abbreviation of Abteilung, which means artillery battalion. So they say you've got an artillery unit, perhaps spotters in the Abbey, so they're sitting there. What they didn't pick up on was the fact that ABT, Abt, is also the German word for abbot. And so you see, well, sometimes language skills helps because, well, you could have got that quite right because it's die Abteilung, so this is feminine, whether it's der Abt, which is masculine. Yeah, so folks out there, listen to your German language classes because sometimes it could spare you from having to bomb a monastery. So they could have solved that quite easily, but they got that wrong. So it's lots of little pictures and puzzle pieces that come together, which in the end they decide that it might be a good idea to bomb the abbey. And as I said earlier, when you are on the ground, you stand there, you can see the abbey from everywhere. And you can understand why the Allied soldiers fighting actually thought that this thing must go, because they didn't know whether the Germans were in there or weren't in there. And it stares at you like some sort of evil beast sitting on the edge of that particular ridge. It's quite stark, I have to say. Not a deep dark wood, but it is there, and it really stares at you. So the Allied soldiers were probably quite happy when it disappeared, because suddenly this beast is gone. And one of the reasons why we know so much about it and why this is still so high on people's agenda and people get exercised about this is, of course, not only that it happened, and this was a very, very, very important place and seat for Christianity, perhaps after the Vatican, one of the most important ones in Christendom, but also because we have some aerial footage from that time, which really quite literally hammers home what it looked like. So Jesse, talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, it turns out that both sides, the Germans and the Allies, filmed the bombing of the abbey. And, well, what is also not guaranteed in history, of course, is that if you create a source, in this case film, that it's going to survive, especially in wartime. And a lot of German records, both paper, archival records, and film, were lost during the war. But the film from both sides, we have. And it's very impressive and, of course, sad to see this happening in real time, in black and white, on film from both sides. But interestingly enough, you can see it on Battle Guide's YouTube channel. They've just put out a video on the battles of Monte Cassino, and they use clips from this original footage. So it's quite impressive and really makes you think about the impact of that decision. Coming back to the military side of things, though, the Allies decide to bomb the abbey position, and they do, but then after that, the Germans decide to occupy it and use it. So the Allied bombing actually creates another useful German position that they're going to have to fight against that didn't exist there before. And I think one of the other impacts, negative impacts from the Allied point of view, is that they don't coordinate this. So they bomb the abbey, but it's not like then the Indian and New Zealand infantry at the base of Monte Cassino storm immediately, taking advantage of the confusion or taking advantage of the fact, well, maybe in their imaginations, that a German position has just been destroyed. No. And so you see this difficulty in proper combined arms operations comes through here as well, in the midst of what some call a war crime, some call a tragic error of judgment, let's say.
And this is played out very nicely when you look at coalition warfare as well, this whole confusion piece. You already mentioned the New Zealand troops and the Indian division. So when they take over from the Americans in the mountainous region to the north and to the northwest of Cassino and the abbey itself, they are told that all the important positions have already been seized. And when you look at the terrain, you see that to the west and to the northwest of the abbey itself, you have a ridge which runs across, and that is called Snake's Head Ridge. And that basically ends in a mountain, the famous Height 593, which overlooks the abbey. So in many ways, this is the most important position. And the Indian division, they are told, no, this is already in American hands. So when they relieve the Americans, they then find out, you know what, this is not true. So they can't actually attack the abbey because they have to seize or try to seize the other heights first. And that's an interesting episode in itself, because if you, as you've just done, look at this and say, well, you need to use the bombing of the abbey to your advantage. What happens is that they bomb this, but only after darkness falls. You then have a very, very small detachment from that division, and that's a company from the 1st Royal Sussex Regiment. That's about 70 men attacking this main German position. So completely disorganized, not coordinated, and of course that attack is repulsed and fails. And at the same time, you also have an attack coming in from the southeast. So this is now from the 2nd New Zealand Division. And they are trying to seize the station, the main station of Cassino, which in those days sits outside of the town itself. The Maori battalion managed to get there. It seized their position. They're trying to improve the road infrastructure, leading back to their own line so that tanks can come forward. When dawn breaks, the Germans realize what's going on. They basically cut off this supply line with artillery fire and then counterattack and drive the New Zealanders out. So this two-prong attack, in the center of which you might say you have the quite logically and geographically, the center of it is the attack on the Abbey, the bombing, it all completely fails. And one of the main reasons is because it's not particularly well coordinated. And all this only takes about 2 to 3 days, depends on how you look at this. So it's a relatively short battle, if you want to call it a battle. And this is also probably one of the reasons why the Germans class, what in the British world is classed, or English-speaking world is classed as Battle 1 and Battle 2, as part of the same battle. For the Germans, it's one ongoing operation here. And after this, there's a bit of a lull. The Allies have to lick their wounds. The Germans keep preparing their defensive lines again. And I can see that Jesse is desperate to say something, because he's raised his finger and he's very, very kind of agile in his seat, moving up and down, edging to the seat of it. So what is it? What is it? Get it off your chest.
Germans have a reputation for being calm, I would say. But here we go. No, I just wanted to add, because this is one of the things that I always think about with smaller actions or battles that don't last long, that fail quickly or what have you. We tend to, pass over them relatively quickly sometimes in general accounts or general histories or general podcasts like ours. But for the men on the ground, it can be an absolutely wild experience. And this is one example. I mean, the Germans don't even consider this a battle. And yet, for those British troops, for those New Zealand troops trying to take the station, or for the Indian troops trying to take the high ground, it's quite a marking experience. And I have a quote here. That's why I wanted to jump in, just to give us a flavor of something that the Germans don't even officially consider a battle, from the point of view of some of the Gurkha troops who were attempting to take point 593 up Snake's Head Ridge. They come after the British have failed to capture that point. So this is an account from a Gurkha officer. But as the leading companies charged into the scrub, they found it was a literal death trap, a dense, chest-high thorn thicket liberally seeded with mines at its outskirts, threaded with tripwires linked to booby traps. In the thicket itself were German emplacements so close that they were within a grenade's throw of the start line, and yet completely hidden in the darkness. The German defenses were based on machine gun posts 50 yards apart. Between each were weapons pits, each containing one man with a machine pistol and a large number of grenades. Owing to their proximity to the Gurkha positions, these posts were not softened up by artillery fire. The attackers had no chance at all. And so I think that gives us a little flavor of the near impossibility of what these smaller units are being asked to do going uphill into this very difficult terrain. And that is the so-called Second Battle of Cassino, where the Allies essentially achieved pretty much nothing. The third battle then, since they're World War I style, if at first you don't succeed, try again. The third battle begins in the middle of March. So we started off in mid-January, now we're in mid-March. The third battle is coming. The Allies decide, after 3 weeks of pouring rain, delays things. So that's also not great for your battlefield mobility when things are being turned into cold mud and the rivers are swelling again. The Allies decide we're going to use our firepower advantage, hopefully a little more effectively this time. And they have a massive artillery bombardment against the town of Cassino. The Indians move. They do take a position called Castle Hill on the approaches to Monte Cassino, let's say. And they reach another position, another feature on that Cassino massif called Hangman's Hill. They're only a couple hundred meters away from the ruins of the Abbey at this point. And yet, it doesn't work out. The New Zealanders as well try to attack again up a track called the Cavendish Road. And again, there's almost nothing that goes right for the Allies. That's at least my very basic summary of the third battle. I don't know if from the German point of view, anything seemed different.
Well, I think we could probably leave it there and say, well, nothing really worked for the Allies, and I think you're absolutely right. So when you look at some of these smaller episodes, really interesting, and you mentioned all these names. So Castle Hill, for example, halfway up to on the way to the abbey, you've got a big castle standing there, ruins of a castle. So Castle Hill was basically seized by a coup de main by the Allied forces. They get there, they seize it, establish defensive positions. And the German paratroopers that have now arrived here, relieved some of the other forces, they now counterattack down from the even higher slopes. And it comes to what in the German after-action report is actually called medieval fighting. Because they bring forward some ladders, they're trying to climb over the walls of the ruins of this castle. There's very, very nasty medieval hand-to-hand fighting. And in the end, the Allies, supported by some other units from the Essex Regiment, for example, managed to hold this position. There's also another episode which shows the type of fighting that you have here. It's very nasty, it's brutal, it's very tough. But you also have a little bit of, I talked about medieval war fighting, a little bit of chivalry here. So there is an episode where the German paras and the Allies, well, they get together and say, we need a ceasefire here. We need to get our wounded out. And then the Germans say, that's brilliant, but we've just arrived here and we don't have any stretchers. So the story goes that the Brits actually give them 4 stretchers to get the German wounded out, which the Germans then return before the fighting starts afresh. So it's an interesting little episode. The Hangman's Hill, you mentioned that as well. So the Gurkhas try to climb up because that's what Gurkhas do very well, climbing up mountains. The Germans spot them, they put them under artillery fire, and they basically cut them off. And so they're now out in the open. In 1944, it's very much open, bare rock, and they basically stay there for several days before they have to withdraw. So it's just underneath the hill of Monte Cassino. And then you mentioned the other famous episode, that's the Cavendish Road, which is basically an old path leading into the mountains, the northern part again of that front line, more or less where the French had attacked during the first episode. This gets widened now so that the Allies can drive up tanks there, because they think that if tanks arrive in this very mountainous area, the German paratroopers, who've now taken over, will be completely surprised. They will not have any anti-tank measurements in place. They will not have anti-tank guns. It's going to be quite easy to roll over the German positions and unhinge the German positions, because this is really about the Snake's Head Ridge and a place called Albaneta Farm, which is to the northwest of Cassino itself, where the Germans have regimental headquarters. That again is a complete disaster. The infantry arrives late, or it doesn't arrive at all, so you have a tank attack going forward all by itself. It's a very, very steep road. A number of tanks fall off the path. They throw the tracks, and that includes the company and the 2IC commanders. Say when the tanks go forward, they don't have any radios. They can't communicate. The guy who's now put in charge is an artillery officer. What he knows about tank warfare, no one really knows. So you can see all sorts of things going wrong. That attack finally goes in and is defeated by the Germans as well, shortly before it hits the so-called Albaneta Road. So a complete disaster. The last thing that you also find is the fighting in Cassino itself. Cassino is now also flattened by artillery bombardment. So first the monastery, now it's the town itself. And in these ruins, you've got the troops of one German Fallschirmjäger battalion. About a third of them, roughly speaking, died during the bombardment. The others survived, and it's really here that the German Fallschirmjäger make their name, because the ferocious fighting that they do here and the way they manage to hold the enemies as they advance, that is the bit that people recognize. So this is really the great day, you might say, the great time of the German paratroopers. It's all hinged around the defense of one particular place. It's a former hotel, the Excelsior, and the Germans actually drive a tank into the building. Whenever they need, they drive it forward again and then drive it back in to give it extra protection. And that's an important place, because this hotel sits right on the crossroads of these major roadworks. But just holding this particular building, they can deny this entire area to the enemy. And they do that really well. So on the German side, it's quite impressive what they actually achieve here. So basically, you're absolutely right. In a nutshell, the third battle, again, doesn't really achieve anything, you might say, for the Allies. So a bit sad on the Allied side.
One thing that it does achieve, in a way, in quotation marks, is extremely heavy losses for the 4th Indian Division. Yeah. We've mentioned them numerous times now. They were absolutely in some of the worst fighting. And I think we don't pay enough attention to the Indian contribution to the Second World War. That single division loses 3,000 men in these actions. at Monte Cassino. And if you think the nominal normal strength of an infantry division is something on the order of about 10,000 men, that is extremely, extremely heavy losses. I mean, the New Zealanders suffered heavily, and the Indians lost almost twice as many as the New Zealanders did in those actions. So let's bring ourselves to the fourth and final battle of Cassino, which begins on the 11th of May. Now, there's a bit of a gap between the third and fourth battles. The Allies regroup. They decide, okay, we are going to launch a larger scale offensive, and they have a little bit of an extra objective with this as well, because by early May, we're starting to get closer to D-Day, June 6th, for the Normandy invasion. So another goal is, well, if we launch a larger, more coordinated offensive in Italy, we might be able to prevent the Germans from sending troops from Italy to Normandy. And we give ourselves a better chance in Normandy as well, if we're thinking at the strategic level. But Operation Diadem, as the fourth battle is also called, has its own goals as well, to finally break this Gustav line. They redeploy some troops, so the French corps is moved. They bring in a Polish corps. They move the British 8th Army, most of it, over to the western side of the Italian peninsula to be able to be involved in this. And they bring in the Canadian division as well, in order to have it as a reserve, especially with the Canadian 1st Armored Brigade, so that when these Allied combined arms troops and infantry troops break this German position, that the Canadian armor will sort of be in the vanguard of rushing up the Liri Valley towards Rome. The Poles are given the unenviable task of trying to take the Cassino Massif and the monastery that sits on top of it. At the same time, there's a breakout attempt from Anzio, because the Anzio bridgehead is still sitting up there. All this time we've been focusing on Cassino again, but they're still sitting up there. So you have a concerted effort along the Gustav Line, the US on the coast, the French in the Aranci Mountains, the British and Canadians getting ready for the Liri Valley, and the Poles trying to take the Cassino Massif, all along this line that we've been talking about, and then Anzio trying to break out as well. They even use some deception to try to make the Germans think that they might do another landing north of Rome. And the Germans seem to partially take that bait, and they hold a panzer division north of Rome, the 26th. So the Allies are a little more prepared for this fourth battle. And how does it play out then, Matthias?
Well, it's basically, as you've already said, decided by manpower. The Allies have realized that they need more men, and as you've already explained, they shift troops into that sector from the former, northeastern front line, the 8th British Army, into the sector. And the Germans know what's going on, but the problem for the Germans is that they simply don't have the manpower to counter this. They're also expecting another landing, as you've already said. They're also thinking that things might be happening at Anzio, so they are now overstretched. So when the attack finally goes in, the German line is relatively swiftly broken. For example, in the south by the now 2nd US Corps, which of course is still part of the 5th Army, the French Corps that's now fighting in the southern sector. So they managed to break through here relatively quickly. Remember, this is the part when the first battle, the Germans had really been worried about progress by the British. They managed to break into the Liri Valley. And the Poles, of course, as you already mentioned, well, they're given the, perhaps you might say, the honor of seizing the abbey. But again, that fighting is not only about the monastery and the abbey, but they do have to fight their way through all these points we've already mentioned before: Snake's Head Ridge, Height 593, Albaneta Farm. That is quite bloody still, and it takes two relatively large attacks by the Poles to seize these positions, and they are now basically in the rear of the Germans, overlooking the monastery. And further in the southern sector, the Germans can see that the Allies are breaking through as well. So the Germans then make the decision to basically leave the abbey and withdraw the troops, because if left them there, this would have been, of course, difficult, because the German troops there would have been cut off. So again, it's an interesting point again, showing you something about the terrain and the way you fight these things. So from a pure military point of view, the abbey itself and the position the abbey stands on is actually of secondary importance. There are other positions that are far more important, like, for example, height 593. Once the Poles have seized these, the Germans realize, you know what, we can't hold this position, and they withdraw. And then you have the 12th Podolski Lancers, Polish unit that actually, on the 18th of May, then gets into the abbey and hoists and raises the Polish flag. Very, very famous pictures from there. And with that, pretty much the fight there comes to an end. So here's some insights from my side about, well, the Polish contribution and how and why the Poles fought there. But I know, Jesse, that you want to say something about that as well.
Well, I mean, I think Monte Cassino is one of the legendary episodes in the Polish story, the Polish view and experience of the Second World War. Because if you think about it, after their defeat in 1939, most Polish troops are prisoners of war, are prisoners of the Germans. And so the fact that this Polish corps is able to capture this prestigious, this very difficult position is something that I think a lot of Poles really draw a lot of attention to, and rightly so. There were a couple of Polish armies late in the war fighting as a part of the Red Army, but it's under different circumstances. They're forced to be there. They have a choice to fight or, be sent to the Gulag as a danger to the Soviet state and a future Soviet Poland. And here we have the main fighting force of free Poland, of that old Poland that existed until 1939. And they do not have an easy time trying to take point 593. There essentially a few times they capture it. It gets taken back by German paratrooper counterattacks. The Poles try to take it again. They suffer heavy casualties. And actually, when they take the abbey and when they raise the flag, they don't have to fight directly for the abbey because the Germans realize, thanks to the French and British advances, that position is not tenable anymore. And so they evacuate in the night. And the Poles are able to then take over the German positions after the Germans have evacuated the ruins of the abbey, let's say. So I feel like we shouldn't underestimate, or we should take the time to emphasize this symbolic importance of this action for the Poles. It's given Poland's later history of then being occupied and controlled by the Soviet Union, this is kind of one of the crowning achievements of free Poland, free Polish troops after the defeat of 1939.
I think that's absolutely right, and you've already said everything. It is really more symbolism and the mythology of the free, the powerful, the strong Poland, probably more than the real military achievement. And you can see it also played out in Anders, General Anders, the commanding general of the Polish corps here. When you look at his personal history, so he fights in the Tsarist army in the First World War, then joins the Polish army, is then captured by the Red Army again. He then becomes the commander of this Polish corps, which was evacuated or moved from the Soviet Union via Iran, Iraq into Palestine. There formed as a corps, keeps fighting, then disillusioned even with the Allies. When in 1944-45 he thinks that they sold the Poles and the Polish nation to the Soviets, is then stripped of his rank and his medals by the Polish government because it's communist. You can see it's really, really, really difficult. And of course he's buried there. So he asked to be buried on the Polish cemetery at Monte Cassino. When you go there, you can see the Polish cemetery is very big, it's very grand, just opposite the abbey, opposite the monastery. So again, of course, there are symbolic and political reasons as to why you have the emphasis on the Polish contribution. And of course, you also have a bear. That's very important. You always have to have a bear. Wojciech the bear, he becomes the mascot of the Polish army. It's a bear that apparently they pick up on their march through Iran. He's gifted to a small girl. She doesn't know what to do with the bear, gives it to the army. And there's an artillery unit that then uses him to carry ammunition up the mountains. And in order to reward him, so the story goes, they give him cigarettes. So there's a bit of a discussion whether he eats the cigarettes or he smokes them, by one of the two. And actually, after the battle is over, there's now a monument to Wojciech the bear in Monte Cassino. He lives out his days, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Edinburgh Zoo. So again, in Polish exile, because he can't go back to, well, not even his homeland, but to Poland. But there's Wojciech the bear.
Eating cigarettes reminds me of the party trick of some guys I went to university with. But that is for another type of podcast entirely.
think you went to the wrong university.
So to very briefly sum up, after this success, the Allies are able to keep pushing. They're able to attack the next defensive line, which was originally called the Hitler Line. Germans quickly changed the name to avoid the embarrassment of losing the Hitler Line. And they keep pushing. And eventually they get to Rome, which falls just before D-Day. Of course, there's some stories about rivalries between the Brits and the Americans and who's going to get to Rome first and why they choose that rather than trying to encircle and destroy the German forces. They kind of let them escape. But all of that, we may have to get into more detail in a future episode. Unless, Matthias, there's a burning observation you've got to make now. No, he assures me there is not. So let us come to our conclusion here. The Cassino campaign, if we can call it that, costs the Allies about 55,000 casualties, costs the Germans, as you can probably guess by now, far less, 20,000 casualties, and costs about 2,000 Italian civilian casualties, which we should not forget about. Matthias, give us the summary here, the takeaway for everyone who's been with us for the past, probably hour or so. Why did this campaign go the way it did? And from the Allied point of view, was it even worth it?
That, of course, is a very big question, and one that's been debated, ever since. Well, actually, since 1943, when all this started. Is it a good idea to go into Italy, or should we be doing something different? I think with the benefit of hindsight, you can say it might have been more useful to do something in a slightly different way, land somewhere differently. The big debate in those days, Italy or Greece, for example. But of course, people didn't know that at the time. You also have to look at it through a 1943 lens and say, well, you've got all this material, you've got all the manpower, you've got the landing craft. We need to use it somewhere. We need to keep pressure on the Germans. Later on in 1944, all of this is going to go to France for the big D-Day landing. So let's do something with the things we have beforehand. So you can't blame people for doing that. I think it's absolutely the right decision. The question then remains, is it sensible to land in southern Italy? Well, what else could you have done? Looking at it through a geographical lens. However, Napoleon once said, well, if you enter Italy, well, it's a boot, so you go in from the top. So that's a bit difficult. I think if you sum up a very, very broad brush now, was the Italian campaign successful for the Allies? I would say it wasn't, with the benefit of hindsight. I would say when you look at what the aims were, it was a failure. Now I'm probably going to get a lot of flack from lots of people who see this very differently. But when you just look at the manpower that's being employed on the Allied side and the German side, the Allies always had more manpower in Italy than the Germans did. Of course, they can afford to do that because they've got more men in the first place. But when you look at it through this lens, I think it was a failure. The same, in many ways, applies to Cassino. When you look at the way it's being fought, you just mentioned the casualties. I find it very difficult to class this as an astounding and overarching victory of the Allies. It was a very successful defensive battle fought by the Germans. One of many. Yes, after this, they have to withdraw and surrender Rome, but that doesn't really matter. So in many ways, it's bad from a psychological point of view, a propaganda point of view, but from a mere military point of view, I don't think the impact was all that great. So in many ways, not overly successful, and they paid with lots of blood, and you've just given the casualty figures. So was it worth it? I would say probably not. It was also very unimaginative on the Allied side, I would say. When you look at what they're doing, and they're basically trying to do the same thing again and again and again, and where they had success, they don't reinforce it. So it's a very methodical, I hesitate to use the word boring or boringly planned, but it's something like this battle. So it's not very daring, not very dashing.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree, even though, the question of alternatives is the difficult one, right? What else could they have done? I sort of feel like, with the benefit of hindsight, Sicily was quite successful. It knocked Italy out of the war. It took that whole manpower away from the Axis. It took that Italian navy more or less out of the question in the Mediterranean. But then you have freedom, strategic freedom to decide what you're going to do if you're the Allies after Sicily has fallen. And I feel like they might have held down a decent number of German divisions in Italy, waiting for a potential landing, even if one doesn't ever come. And maybe there could have been some other options in Greece, although Greece is also a narrow, mountainous peninsula. So that might have also led to some difficulties. Here we are coming back to the old Churchillian question of maybe Yugoslavian coast or who knows what. We don't have time for that today, folks, because this episode is coming to a close. But before we finish off, we have a listener question that came in. And we have a few, actually. We're going to pick one for today. I'm going to surprise Matthias here because he doesn't know which one I'm about to read out. But I'm going to choose one about the Axis and Axis cooperation. And the question is, what advantage did the Axis get from their alliance? Apart from, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, were there any real collaborations for training, for advising, for material support between Germany and Japan? I mean, there were some between Germany and Italy, but Italy is not as consequential. How would you answer that, Matthias? Was there really an Axis kind of collaboration or not so much?
I would say there wasn't an awful lot. There's a little bit, mainly also before the war actually breaks out. So you have a number of Japanese delegations coming to Germany to look at industry and look at armament production. But on the whole, it's relatively limited at that particular stage. There are a number of reasons for that. I think, first of all, the Germans didn't really want to share too much of their information. The second thing is the Japanese are fighting a very different type of war, where you need very different type of equipment. And when you look at the strategy, I think it's fair to say that they didn't really have a lined up strategy at all. And this is in many ways is one of the big problems they find. We talked about this in previous episodes. The Allies are very, very good at coordinating their strategies. The Axis powers are quite poor at that. Perhaps the one time where there's a little bit of this is actually just before the attack on Pearl Harbor, where there is a little bit of interaction and the Japanese and the Germans discussing should the Japanese attack the Soviet Union or should they actually continue their push towards Southeast Asia. So you find there's a little bit, and strange enough, the Germans telling them not to attack the Soviet Union because they think they can do it all by themselves at that stage. So interesting. But apart from that, it's very, very limited. So there isn't a lot. Geography, of course, also plays a role here. But yes, in a nutshell, they could have done this much, much better.
Right. So there you have it. We will try to get to the rest of the questions that we've received in future episodes. That was the lucky question for today. Thanks so much for listening, folks. If you liked it, leave us a review. If you have a question, send us an email and we'll try to get to it. That was it for Monte Cassino and the Casino campaign, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Ciao, ciao.
You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
So here's a little... Sorry, I just want to throw it back to you. Do you want to throw it back?
I was just going to take it. No, throw it.
And the Germans, these are now the paratroopers who have now arrived in force.
Sorry. It's a coup de main.
What did I say?
Coup d'etat.
Coup d'etat, that's something different. Okay, go back. Don't say coup d'etat. That's wrong. Coup de main, you're absolutely right.
Coup de main.
Coup d'etat.
Hey, whatever.